All right. Well, we come, as I said, to the last class this morning, and it is on the subject of presbyteries and general assemblies. I usually have separate classes for this, but because of the schedule, we need to scrunch it together. So what we're dealing with is actually just church government that begins and is exercised at the session level, enlarged, both at presbytery and then at the General Assembly level. There's very little that is actually new or different. So we'll see how that unfolds. Chapter 12 of the government, we're speaking about governing assemblies, says all governing assemblies have the same kinds of rights and powers. This is again rather significant to Presbyterianism. I'm going to emphasize this once or twice during the hour, that whereas some denominations have hierarchical governmental structures and others have staunchly independent governmental structures, the Presbyterians are trying their best to tie everything together and to be mutually accountable and mutually supportive. And so when you start at the local level and you have the exercise of power on the part of the elders of the local church, the exercise of powers, as the book says, is no different at presbytery, and neither is it at General Assembly. There isn't anything handed down from on high that is not voted on at the lower levels. So these rights and powers are to be used to maintain truth and righteousness and to oppose erroneous opinions and sinful practices that threaten the purity, peace, or progress of the church. So the first charge of elders, as you get from Acts 15, when Paul speaks to them, you are to guard the truth. The truth is the most important aspect of government in the church. And that, of course, means that it has to start off by meaning the very essence of truth is defined by the Word of God. And that comes back to our doctrinal unity, our need to be agreed on what is truth. And so that's a very important thing. That's one of the first priorities that church government has is guarding the truth. And it's by the truth that you will know and detect and see wolves among the sheep. May sound a little silly, but that's precisely how Paul stresses it in Acts 15. You will not recognize them, you will not understand them, you will not discern the difference in the message if you do not have a handle on truth, if you do not have a unity on doctrine. And so it's very important that for every aspect of the church, all assemblies have the right to resolve questions of doctrine, because questions do come up from time to time, and questions about discipline reasonably proposed, and the power to obtain evidence and to inflict censures. So wherever there is truth, of course, there is also the violation of truth. Wherever there is discipleship, there is also the need for discipline. And this is the exercise of elder authority that is built into the membership vows and the examination when we bring people before the session for examination. It's the exercise of spiritual authority we are demonstrating to them, and the questions of membership reflect that when saying, are you willing to submit to this authority in a spiritual manner? And that, of course, is the part that people usually chafe at when issues of morality or doctrine arise, and it becomes very, very hard for the elders to exercise that spiritual authority that you have vowed to submit to when there is that kind of tension and awkwardness and resistance. Not blaming anybody for that, but saying that is often the case. Paragraph 2, each governing assembly exercises exclusive original jurisdiction over all matters belonging to it. There is a jurisdiction that the local session has. The members of the local church. The jurisdiction of presbytery governs the regional churches in its area. And when that happens, they cannot carte blanche impose legislative authority or spiritual authority over things outside of that boundary. So this is a kind of a forensic or a legal definition of authority. The session exercises jurisdiction over the local church, presbytery over what is common to the ministers, sessions, and the church within a prescribed region, and the General Assembly over such matters as concern the whole church. Disputed matters of doctrine and discipline may be referred to a higher governing assembly. A local church can ask the presbytery to get involved, but the presbytery may not impose itself by getting involved in local church affairs unless it's requested. The lower assemblies are subject to the review and control of the higher assemblies in regular graduation. These assemblies are not separate and independent, but they have a mutual relation, and every act of jurisdiction is the act of the whole church performed by it through the appropriate body. So in other words, with one voice. We speak with one voice. If something is judged as heresy in one presbytery, then it has to be absorbed and dealt with by the other presbyteries, or else it has to be challenged by the other presbyteries. We want the unity, again, the unity of doctrine, the unity of truth has to be embraced. So to get a real understanding of Presbyterianism in the abstract, and I say this gently because man is, the saint is a sinner saved by grace. And we always have to remind ourselves of that there are always going to be cases and conditions and circumstances where the temptation to override, overrule, present as an alternative various ways in which things are to be done and handled, and they always need to be guarded against because of the nature of man and the principle of unity in the assembly. So you first start with the local church, and in Presbyterianism, the government is indeed pushing that authority down. That itself is radical thought. I said that the local church can appeal to the presbytery for its help, but a presbytery that knows best will say, why do you want us to get involved, rather than say, oh yes, we'll help you. You know, like Ronald Reagan said, we're from the government and we're here to help. The presbytery should be resistant, theoretically, principally resistant. Why do you want us to meddle in your affairs? Handle this yourself. You're the elders, you do it. That's the way it should be. The elders should have the backbone and the resources and the courage to do what needs to be done, and only if after all of that they still need help, then they may appeal to the presbytery. That's theoretically how it's supposed to work, and I say that because that is probably one of the easiest violated rules in Presbyterianism. Another church may want to get involved, and so it talks up a good line at Presbytery to say, we need to help these dear brothers, just so that they can meddle in their affairs, and I have seen that firsthand. And it's not a pretty sight. In fact, let me get my history straight here. When the PCA broke off from the mainline church, one of the fundamental principles that they were complaining against was that presbyteries had become the center of power. Presbyteries were exercising their force and their rule on the local churches, and they wanted to break away from that. They didn't want presbytery to have that sovereign power over the local churches in that way. And so that's one reason why today in General Assemblies of the PCA, every single church may be represented. It's not it's not General Assemblies are not representations of the presbyteries, they're representations of every single church, because that was a way to deny the presbyteries that power that they had taken on and exercised to greater influence. It was a way of putting them back in their place, and it was a right thing to do at that time. So the presbytery is supposed to say, you start by saying, we don't want this to be shoved upstairs, kicked upstairs. We don't want to handle anything unless we have to. But once their presbytery is convinced they do have to be involved, then they do get involved in it, and that is a resource that the local church has. Say your pastor decides to take over, and he gets rid of all of the elders, and he says it's all going to be run the way I want it to be run. The church has an appeal to presbytery, and they have an authority over that minister. That minister is not a member of the local church. He is answerable to presbytery. So that is to the safety of the local church, that they have that ability to appeal to the presbytery level government. And it's the same with the assembly. The assembly is simply handles the affairs that are charged to it on a regular basis, which is evangelism and missions and the program of the church at large. But if the presbytery involved reaches, says we need help, they are there for that as well. And so everybody is covered with a sense of accountability. And so on one hand, the resources can be appealed to, but on the other hand, the gravity of Presbyterianism is always downward. You handle it. Unless you need us, we don't want to assume control. That's the theory of Presbyterianism, okay? That's the theory. And that is what, when it works well, that is what keeps the church functioning. It keeps it from getting top-heavy, keeps it from getting to a point where you do have others who are pushing their weight around. Paragraph 3, assemblies have the authority to erect committees and commissions and to delegate to them specific interim powers. Every denomination needs committees, delegating work to smaller groups of people so that work can be done more efficiently. Some denominations are all too eager to delegate everything to a committee. That again is a demonstration of that government. If you were to put this sideways, for instance, you have the larger assembly, whatever it is, the church, the local church, presbytery, or general assembly, and you push off. The temptation is to push off the work of the whole onto a committee. Now, in some cases, that committee is necessary. And it's maybe the tedium of the situation, maybe the work it's going to take is too long. It's always necessary. But the temptation is to slough it off to a committee because it just speeds up the work of the larger body because everybody else just wants to go home. And that is not proper. To cast off, to delegate to smaller groups, gives that smaller group, that committee, more authority than you really want them to have. And once they have that authority, it is hard to get it back. And so while every Presbyterian denomination will have committees, there will be some who will say, we need to be careful, we need to keep our thumb on the committee, report well, and do as much work on the floor as we can. And the other will say, let's just give it to them because they know the people on the committee. And before you know it, it becomes political. Politics is something the church is never, ever excluded from. And it is the thing you must always be aware of. Larger churches with ministers and elders and their agendas will try to control smaller churches by way of committees. It's one of the first and foremost ways of exercising non-Presbyterian power. And so you have to have it, but again, it's one of those things that you always have to guard it. And that's why, for instance, I think it says in here, certain interim powers to always give a committee, do you have a long-standing or a continual standing committee, or do you just have a committee that does certain work? I think one of the things I would probably favor or lean on would be committees that only have certain work and then they're done. They do not have long-standing positions, because that just means that the committee takes more and more power. Committees are different than commissions. Commissions, by definition, are interim or temporary, and they have one charge. They do what they're supposed to do, and then their authority is done. When we were received into the OPC here recently, Jerry Malkus and Charles Biggs were the commission of Presbytery to receive us into the denomination. Once the service ended, their authority was gone. They had no more authority in that regard. A commission is also different from a committee in that a committee has to report to the presbytery everything it does. Doesn't mean it has to report everything it thinks about or says or does to get to a certain point, but it has to report all the decisions it makes. A commission is charged, it is the presbytery in action in a smaller form. So in other words, it was a commission that came to do that reception service, because that carried the authority of presbytery, and not a committee that just would do a study and then report back. And also, you notice that the form of government emphasizes here, as well as the PCA did, voting by proxy shall not be permitted in the assemblies, nor shall anyone be allowed to vote except when the vote is being taken. This really does protect and defend the right of debate and the need for honest debate before making a decision. If you're voting in absentia, you're not interested in debate. If somebody is voting by proxy, that means you're giving them the authority to take your vote. You are loading them with more authority than they should have. And so that becomes political. But that's the main reason why the only ones who can vote need to be present, so that they hear the discussion on both sides and they make their decision based on that regard for one another. So here are a couple of typical docketed schedules for presbytery meetings. I took the last one of Chesapeake that I had and the last one at Mid-Atlantic OPC that I sat in. They are very similar in many ways, but let me just point out a couple of things that come up. First of all, they both begin with a worship service. This itself is probably critical or very important in my mind. Presbytery comes together. It is the larger church. It is the church body of which these ministers are members. This is their church. And so I think that a worship service is the best way to start said meeting. A worship service should go through the practical steps of worship. The sermon should speak to the ministers, and in the same way that the ministers speak to their local congregations. This is an area where pragmatism often takes over in presbytery meetings. We delegate the worship service that we're going to have to a committee that decides who's going to preach. And in Chesapeake Presbytery for a long time, that committee would decide who's going to preach in the morning, and whoever they decided was worthy to hear would be. Sometimes they brought in guests that kind of supported their angle, their political desire. Other times it would be the ministers of larger churches, and you would hear from them. It recently changed in Chesapeake to become alphabetical. Now you would go through all of the churches alphabetically, and so that they would preach. In the old school style, the use of the sermon in the morning, the worship service, would be delegated to licentiates or ordinands. and so you could hear them preach. I think that is probably one of the best ways to do it, because an ordinand or a licentiate is going before presbytery for examination and for vote. And so you should, if you're a presbytery, you are the ones who need to hear the man preach. But because in many churches and many denominations, that is sloughed off to the committee, and before you know it, the committee sits in session and hears the candidate or candidates preach before them. And then if their docket is heavy, they will say, well, preach for 15 minutes. I think the record was 10. Preach for 10 minutes and then we'll just call it quits. And so you get into more and more of less and less. I think that this probably needs to be protected. The idea that the worship service in the morning needs to be complete, needs to be preached by one coming before you for vote. And if that's not, if that isn't there, then let the host church minister bring the message. I think that makes the most sense. But anyway, there's different ways to do that. The docket in Chesapeake Presbytery then followed with a program committee. The program committee is also made up of just a few people in the presbytery, and their agenda would always be first and foremost in what they wanted you to give 30 minutes of your time. So after the worship service, the program committee would say, we're going to hear from X, another address, a teaching, a video, and I think the classic case that stuck in my mind was when we watched a video of an interview with Rockstar. And that was the minister's to the minister's benefit. We're going to hear this rock star criticize the church, and that was a good use of presbytery time. Then you have the various reports, and you do have the various committees, and that's very parallel in the way that works. The OPC Mid-Atlantic does have standing committees. They do have regular people charged for the various things. Chesapeake Presbyterian, the PCA, envelops Baltimore, and so a big concern for Chesapeake is the Urban Mercy Ministries Committee. That's a very important aspect there. In Mid-Atlantic, they have a visitation committee, which is a way of just informally coming and observing the churches, seeing how things are done, encouraging the minister in the sessions, and to build fellowship and development. So they're very similar other than that, but there's nuances that you should be aware of, and I've tried to point those out. When it comes to the regional church and its presbytery, paragraph 1, a regional church consists of all the members of local congregations and the ministers within a certain district. The presbytery is the governing body of a regional church. It consists of all ministers and all ruling elders of the congregations of the regional church. So the presbytery is made up of the elders and ministers of the churches in that region. You remember when I said when we ordained Kurt Sharping to the role of pastor, when we ordain somebody to a ruling elder here, in the Presbyterian system, we are appointing them to the highest office in the Presbyterian system. And so there is nobody above that. Presbytery is not is not one man who, like in the Methodist system of government, governs regional churches by himself and tells ministers anytime he wants that they will be rotated out of this. You're not going to this church. You're not going to this church. The church governs her own affairs, including the ministers and how long they stay. And so presbytery is assembly of the ruling elders and teaching elders from the local churches. And so they gather together as brothers, as mutual one vote kind of thing, the same principle as the session, and that there is not supposed to be political influence one over the other. But again, it's a hard thing to avoid. There are some churches that are smaller, maybe have 1 or 2 ruling elders, and they don't have the voice that somebody in the largest church in the presbytery might have, just simply because you've got significance, because you are the largest church, because you've got money that's given to presbytery. The tendency is to listen to what he has to say and kind of follow him along, and so that politics is always going to be there. You can't get away from it, unfortunately. But it should always be something we're called to rebuke in the numbers and change. Okay. Paragraph 3: the meetings of presbytery shall be composed insofar as possible of the ministers on the roll. The ministers are the members of presbytery, not of the local church. That's why presbytery has to be involved in approving the new minister, not controlling who comes, but approving of him. The little OP church that I started in Amsterdam came from 6 couples who walked out of their United Presbyterian Church because the last straw was they lost their minister. Their minister moved on. I can't remember who it was, but moved on, and Presbytery gave them a list. You may choose from one of these men. No, that's not the way it works. That's the power of the presbytery pushing its weight on the local church, and so ministers of presbytery shall be composed insofar as possible of the ministers of the roll and one ruling elder. In the OPC, it's the presbytery commissioners are only one ruling elder and all the teaching elders from your church. It's 2 in the PCA. 2 ruling elders may go to a presbytery meeting and your teaching elders. And the moderator shall be chosen from among its members from year to year. There usually is some balance to that. You know, you might have a presbytery's governmental form might say, one year we'll have a teaching elder do it, another year we'll have a ruling elder do it, and they go back and forth. That's one way of keeping the balance. That's a good thing. Paragraph 5, the presbytery has the power to order whatever pertains to the spiritual welfare of the churches under its care, always respecting the liberties guaranteed to the individual congregations under the Constitution. In the exercise of its jurisdiction, the presbytery has responsibility for evangelism within the bounds of its region. That's why in the OPC, most presbyteries will have a regional home missionary. That's the role that Charles Biggs plays in our presbytery. His full-time job is to get church plants going within the region. And so he will spend all his time, he's in evangelism and one-to-one counseling and discipleship and building up churches that start up in the region, especially in areas which are not within the sphere of service in any one congregation. Similarly, the presbytery shall seek to foster fellowship in worship and nurture in the church as a whole within its region. The presbytery has the power to organize and receive congregations. Ta-da! That's what we did. To unite and dissolve congregations. Sometimes churches will merge. Other times they will have to be dissolved. And in that case alone, does the assets of the church come into presbytery supervision. Not ownership, but supervision. Church, back in Amsterdam when we were renting a building, sharing a building with another denominational church, that church dwindled down to like 20 members, and finally they said, we're closing. Well, so there was that building, and we were renting from them, but they were closing. The members just walked away from it. The supervision of that building went to their presbytery, and as it worked out, our church was able to buy the building from the presbytery at that point. So, but that's the only time, other than in the UP church history, when assets are under presbytery control. Back in the 80s, when churches were beginning to leave at a rather panicking number from the UP Church, they scrambled to put into the Constitution a line that said the assets of local churches belong to the denomination as a way of controlling them. So less and less churches, shut off the valve, let people, we're losing too many churches. And it was obviously a panic move on their part. So it can happen. It can happen. Yeah. Further, the presbytery has power to receive and issue all appeals and other matters that are brought before it from church sessions in a regular manner, to resolve questions of doctrine or discipline seriously and reasonably proposed, to condemn erroneous opinions which injure the purity of peace in the church, to take under its care, examine, and license candidates for the holy ministry, and to ordain, install, remove, and judge ministers. So again, you have an issue in your local church that the session decides on, makes a decision about. But a member of the church thinks that that's unfair, so it will complain to the session in proper order. The session reviews its decision and may understand what the complaint is about, or may say, no, we're standing by our decision. And if that's the case, then the member can appeal to the presbytery. And if it's in order, if the appeal is in order, then the session must account for its decision before presbytery. So there is that governing the ability to keep the local session from getting too much control. Same deal. I was going to elaborate on that, but I already have. Paragraph 6, the presbytery shall also report to the General Assembly each year the licensures, ordinations, receiving, dismissing of members, the removal of members by death, organization, reception, union, or dissolution of congregations, or the formation of new ones. So in other words, the presbytery is accountable to the General Assembly for the business that it transpires during the year. Not for OP's approval, not for the General Assembly's approval of what happened, but for reporting purposes. We closed this congregation, we opened up these two, we did this business, we did that business. They just want to make sure everything was done decently and in order, which of course is a Presbyterian slogan, decently and in order. When you get to the General Assembly, chapter 15, paragraph 1 says, the whole church consists of all the members of its regional churches. Whereas the local church is not regionally defined. Some of you folks come from 15, 20, 30, 45 minutes away, so we're not regionally defined, but the presbytery is regionally defined. Whatever is in our geographical jurisdiction, all of the churches are in that situation. So we didn't have an option to go to another presbytery in the PCA, even if it meant more travel time to us. We were stuck in the situation we had. The General Assembly the jurisdiction of the Assembly is the globe, the whole world. So you have not only all of the churches, all of the presbyteries reporting to the General Assembly, but you also have all of its mission works all over the world and everything that they're doing. Everybody reports to the General Assembly once a year. Now, going back to this first, assemblies historically can fall in either one of two categories. One can be representative, which is really more definitive in terms of Presbyterianism, meaning that just like the teaching elders and one ruling elder can go to presbytery, then the presbyteries usually are given a certain number of commissioners they can elect and send to General Assembly. So it's the commissioners elected from the presbytery that go, and that's called representative assembly. But then you have, like the PCA, which wants to bypass presbytery authority and power and allow every church to be represented, then that's called non-representative General Assemblies. You have push and pull in both cases. I think that the representative probably comes out the best in terms of pragmatic exercise. But I've heard on the floor of presbyteries when they are electing their commissioners, guys stand up and say, "We want the guys we elect to vote this way," which is improper. That's exercising political authority and maneuvering, and it's improper to do that. But every time there is an election, there's always going to be the undertow of politics, and the challenge is always to try to suppress it and deny it if possible. Paragraph 2, the General Assembly, which, now this is in the OPC, the General Assembly, which in the governing body of the whole church shall consist of not more than 155 voting commissioners. That vote is arbitrary. I sat under the professor at Westminster Seminary who was on a committee to come up with that number, and he said, it just sounded good to me. Not really much rationale to it, but it is a representative demonstration of the entire church, and it limits the number of commissioners to a small, group of men who can deal with things in that situation. So that's a sign. That's the definition of their version of represented assembly. 155 voting commissioners, including the moderator, stated clerk of the previous assembly, stated clerk of the current assembly. What that means is that in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, you have a small number of men, and therefore you have more of a collegiate atmosphere, more of like just a larger version of a session meeting or even a presbytery meeting. You will still know most of these men by name. You will see them year after year. There is fellowship. There's camaraderie. There can be more opportunity for dialogue and friendship. So there are great positives to the limiting of the number of men that go to the assembly. But of course, because it's limited, because it's representative, the who goes can sometimes get out of hand. And again, politics you always have to be on guard against politics. The PCA, on the other hand, is just the opposite. It is non-representative. If you've ever seen a PCA General Assembly, it is completely different. You have probably anywhere from 1,500 to 1,700 commissioners, and you probably have 1,000 more people on site for support, that are support staff. And there is no way you are ever going to be able to know very many people firsthand. But the argument for the non-representative is that the church is completely represented here. And the idea that, that no one is left out, that we shut the door on no one, everyone has a voice, so to speak.
If you can pay.
Well, we'll get to that. But, one of the benefits to representative government is that you do have the opportunity and strategy of debate. You get up and you will be given floor time to speak, and that's a good thing, to give your time for debate. If you'll notice in the PCA assembly here that's pictured, you got 1, 2, 3, 4. There probably are 2 more out here and 2 more out here. There's usually 6 microphones, and you can queue up behind those microphones, and you may get a chance to speak on the floor, but 9 out of 10 times, the moderator will always start by saying, we're limiting debate to 10 minutes, which means you might get up and stand in line at any given mic, and you will never be heard. it's really quite a different animal. Yes, sir.
So I may not be understanding this correctly, but I think I'm not understanding correctly. I hope I'm not. The problem that you keep hinting is the politics of the Presbyterians or General Assembly, and then you go to emphasize that the OPC does a representative General Assembly. The issue with that, and like you said, it does allow for camaraderie and closer friendships, but doesn't that also allow for more politics?
I said that. I said it doesn't exclude. There are still politics that can go on with those who are elected by Presbytery to go to General Assembly. I gave the illustration of someone standing up at the Presbytery and says, we want to vote in somebody who will vote this way. So politics is definitely there, and it needs to be guarded against. You're going to have politics on both sides. I'm not saying one is without politics and the other isn't. But it's a different form. It's a different animal, if you will. And so there's politics on both sides. Yes, sir.
One more question along those lines. What in the OPC, what is the split between teaching elders and ruling elders?
The split, what do you mean?
In other words, out of your General Assembly of 155, how many would be teaching elders versus ruling elders?
I don't know for sure, but I think every presbytery has a certain number that they will send. Like if they can send 9 men, if the presbytery can send 9 men to General Assembly, 5 will be teaching elders and 4 will be ruling elders. That kind of thing. There's usually some. Yes, and only if, when I was in New York and England, there was this. We could vote 9 men in, and there were 5 and 4, and only if we couldn't fill the 4. Usually that was much more the case. Ruling elders are much more restricted and much more reluctant to give their precious time to General Assembly, and we all understand that. Only if we could not fill all 4 of the ruling elders would we allow another teaching elder to go. So yeah, there's usually an effort to balance that. So again, Graham, I'm not saying there's no politics in the one and not in the other. Do you understand now?
Sort of, but I'm sort of confused because, at least in my life, we've always been taught that for the ruling of a nation, democracy is not going to work. It needs to be a representative government because you're going to have mob rule. But in a thing such as an organization like the church, don't you want as many elders and representatives as possible at the meeting to hear every single issue and for, in this case, more is more against the proverb, because the more you have there, the more, if they didn't limit it, it obviously would take a whole lot longer, but it seems that squishing the numbers down is not going to, it's a way to govern in a succinct and efficient manner, but it's also a way to very quickly swerve off the path. Whereas at the larger majority, there's a whole lot of different opinions that slows everything down, and slower, and especially governing things, is a lot better, because when you don't have decisions happening quickly, less things happen faster, and you can usually preserve your state of formation in a much longer time frame.
Yeah, your lengthy argument would be for non-representative assemblies, but the problem is obvious. There's not any way that this is going to be a truly functioning body of people. They have to delegate. They probably delegate close to 90% of their work to committees. And so the General Assembly nowadays is hearing not issues so much as reports from committees. Smaller groups of people decide what they think the Assembly should do, and then they report, and the Assembly votes to approve that. There is very little work that is actually done on the floor of the Assembly just because of the size. For instance, you have the Assembly appointing its Standing Judicial Commission. Standing Judicial Commission is that which deals with cases of trial, offenses that have been judged by sessions, by presbyteries, and now come to General Assembly. The Standing Judicial Commission is the one who actually deals with the trial. And then they report to the Assembly what they decided. And that's all the Assembly hears, is what they decided. If a judicial issue actually makes it to the Assembly in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, that last debate is done on the floor. And so everybody gets involved. So I'm not arguing necessarily that this is what we should do and this is not what we should do, but I'm just trying to point out the weaknesses and the strengths of both sides. To go along with this PCA General Assembly, you have to have a place that is big enough to house 3,000 to 4,000 people at one time. And that means that you are limited to large cities, you are limited to conference centers, and you are paying pretty top dollar. It's just the nature of that beast. I'm not. Never mind. I won't say that because I don't want to be accused of being prejudiced. But so the atmosphere of the PCA assembly is very much different than this. You go to a General Assembly for the PCA, you have to procure a hotel room downtown in Atlanta or downtown in Charlotte or downtown wherever they have the thing, and that means that the hotel rooms are going to be pricey. You have to eat, and the only places available are the high-priced restaurants that are around the conference center that they're doing. So in transportation, you might want to drive and pay the parking, or you might want to taxi in. All of that is expense that is brought by the reason of the size of the assembly. Housing 155 people plus is not anywhere near as hard, nor are you limited to large, expensive places. But to go along, one other thing about the General Assembly of the PCA is to go along with that is an attending room that is just as big that is set aside for vendors. You have, and vendors come, and they come with all kinds of topics and opportunities that they want you to know about. Last year, there were 121 different vendors. They can register as vendors under the gold plan, which means they pay a lot for floor space, or the silver, or the bronze. And they come in categories like colleges, seminaries, other organizations, book publishers, associations and ministries, businesses, missionary endeavors, investment partnerships, church facilitators, prison ministries, pro-life and adoption agencies, military support groups, ministerial facilitators, magazine publishers, nonprofit organizations, diaconal endeavors, retreat and conference centers, evangelism organizations, internet service providers, you name it, it's there. And if you notice, what do you have in this place? First of all, it's a place where you meet people, you run into people, and you talk. And it's a wonderful opportunity to catch up with old friends and to visit. It's a place where families can come. Lots of time the families will spend time in the vendor area during the assembly. There's other times when I'm afraid, like me, you get hung up in the book sections, and there's more than one. Up here is the PCA bookstore, down here is somebody else, and it's the bookstore, and somebody else is up here. And you're just looking at books, and you're buying books and everything else. And without blaming any of these guys, the temptation is just to do this. Why sit there in a floor with 1,600 other people when you can wander around and buy things? And so it becomes a real temptation to spend all of your time in the vendor booths than not. And so the assembly structure and personality is on your sheet, and you can look at that. The OPC has a representative. That comes from the Scottish tradition. The OPC currently has about 32,000 members. The PCA is non-representative, and that they have 380,000 members. And you'll know the one thing I'll point out about this is that the PCA General Assembly runs 2.5 days, period. You know, a day to get in, a day to get out, so you're there for 5 days, but the business is 2.5 days, period. That's it. And so if it's going to be that short, you have to go committees, you have to delegate, and you have to, reserve all that, and they'll give you a lot of reading material that nobody's ready to read before they have a vote, and it gets a little chaotic. The OPC does things differently. They stretch their business over 5 business days, but they start on Wednesday and they'll run over to Tuesday. Now, one of the benefits to that is that you're there for the weekend and you can worship at another OPC church, which is a great encouragement to them and stuff. So there's just more opportunity for fellowship and that collegiate atmosphere again. But I wanted to point out to you the ARP, which I think they've got it right. They beat everybody else, I think. The ARP is non-representative. That means everybody can come. I'm not in favor of that necessarily. 22,000, it's smaller than the OPC. All TEs, one ruling elder from each congregation, so they have about 260 in their attendance. They, every single year, it'll be only 2.5 to 3 business days, every single year, they have their assembly in the Von Clarken Conference Center, which is idyllic. It's retreat. It's got a retreat atmosphere to it. It's relaxing. The kids go out and they play at the lake. You do business and you all eat together or in prearranged, catered circumstances. You don't go out to expensive restaurants. You don't do a bag lunch, which sometimes is what the OPC does. And I just think they've got it nailed, that's all. You can't beat what the ARP does here. I don't even know where Von Clarken is, but it's somewhere here. But yeah, and just between you and me, we did consider the ARP. Okay.
That was the secret draw, right?
Okay, I got to hurry up. Paragraph 3. The General Assembly meets once a year. General Assembly seeks to advance the worship, edification, witness of the whole church. It shall seek to resolve all doctrinal disciplinary questions handed up to it, not imposed down from it. It shall seek to promote the unity of the church through the correspondence with other churches. The duties particular to the GA include the organizing regional churches, presbyteries, reviewing the records of those presbyteries, calling ministers and licentiates to the missionary or other fields, and then the General Assembly is not invested with power by virtue of its own authority. One of the interesting things about General Assembly is when it is done, it is over. It's like a commission. It dissolves. It has no continuing power over you, saying, we're going to vote that you have to do this, and if you don't, we're going to come after you. Their power stops at the end of the assembly. That's one of the safeguards. So that's a bit different. Okay, any other questions? You ready to be a commissioner? All right, give up. Let's pray.